Good evening, good afternoon, depends on where you're located in the world. Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I believe, as it's been properly said, we have to look towards those opportunities for climate funding to be able to reach these key stakeholders concerning forest conservation throughout the world, which are the indigenous peoples. First of all, thank you kindly. My name is Fabiola Munoz. I'm the moderator of this session, and merely for the audience to be able to follow us and to be able to ask questions. Hence the question that I would ask you all, which are the most important hurdles or barriers which make this flow of capital towards the indigenous people and nature not reach them? So please accompany us throughout these thoughts. We have little time, so I will not spend much time in introducing our different speakers. Aldo, besides him, we've been in touch and we've known each other for some time now. He is the director and co-founder of Amazonia Intaldentos. And Aldo will be accompanying us during this first stage. Aldo, you have been recognized. Good morning to all of you, and thank you, Fabiola. It's a pleasure being here, and thank you to the Global Landscape Forum for the initiative and promoting these projects, which are extremely important if we wish to face climate change and the loss of biodiversity. First of all, I'm going to summarize the main hurdles that we have identified by, or have been identified by the panelists and others, of course, that have been identified by other different agencies. As Fabiola has just said, if you wish to include any barriers based on your experience, please include them in the chat. We have identified 6 barriers. The first is the minimum investment size. These are barriers formulated from the investor side, but also concerning the developers of projects and the indigenous peoples. The minimum size is the first one, and the opportunities of investing in projects with indigenous peoples are small, and the global investors are searching for larger investors greater than $5 million in average. Now, the second one are the high transaction costs, the time allotted and the necessary resources requested by investments of this nature, taking into account the cultural complexity, and of course can make a project be unviable from a financial perspective. The third item is a lack of guarantee. The financial organization, in other words, the banks, require collateral or guarantee to make sure that a loan can be provided. And usually for this purpose, the collateral or guarantee are the lands, the real estate, and taking into account that the majority of indigenous lands are communal lands, it's not possible to use them as guarantee for loans. And this definitely creates difficulties to have access to funding. On the other hand, the limited pre-investment resources. And what are we saying? The need to be able to improve the socializing outreach development of capability programs in these agencies or organizations of local communities with the goal in mind to create favorable conditions for investment purposes. And the other thing is a lack of proposals for these to be ready to receive investments, indigenous organizations, for example, and the need to improve technical capabilities in these indigenous groups. And the last item that we have identified are rather thinking more on carbon matters and towards the future, the biodiversity credits. Hence, these type of markets, ecosystemic markets, they're still in the early stages. These are volatile markets, quite complex and high risk levels, not only for investors, but for the indigenous peoples and the local communities. And on the other hand, we carried out a survey with more than 40 investors with the coalition investors a year ago, and they identified that the main barriers that limited investments were the limited supply of opportunities, which are ready for investment purposes that I mentioned before, and the lack of the general knowledge of investors concerning on how to carry out business and how to invest in the Amazon. And this is a key issue which sometimes we leave aside. And concerning this event, I would say, and I would add that there is a general lack of knowledge of investors of how to make business and investing with the indigenous peoples. I believe that I have followed my time. These are the main barriers, and we can remark upon them later on. Well, thank you. Thank you kindly to Aldo. He has summarized things. I believe that he places us at the center of this discussion. We know that the indigenous peoples are key in these processes, and we have conscientious investors that are searching to place resources to contribute to face the climate change issue. But something is happening here. What Aldo has just said, I would add two crucial elements. One is the lack of knowledge, the lack of understanding of the local realities of the indigenous peoples, in other words, how do they see the world, in other words, and the lack of knowledge. It takes us towards the second item, which is fear. Sometimes we do not cross the barrier, and there's much fear. And to address these elements, what can we do to be able to generate the proper bridges? I shall invite now the different speakers that we have for this session. I will name them first of all, and thereafter we shall hold this conversation. Juan Carlos Quinquiach, he's a great friend. He's the executive secretary of the Global Alliance, basically on the communities. Marele who says she works on the triads investment management and lending management. And Aldo, I already introduced him. And part of what Aldo conveys is that gaze of this new way of seeing things on behalf of investors, what's needed for investment purposes. And then Madam Palacio, she's the regional manager of the territory, the regional territory. And what I wish to do at present is to invite you all to reflect on this, Maria Pia, Juan Carlos, and Mareike. Let's reflect on what we can do and how your work contributes towards accelerating these capital flows that will reach nature, that will reach the territories of indigenous peoples. What have you seen? What might we do? Please, just 3 minutes approximately to be able to hear your first few ideas. Let's start with Maria Pia.
Sí, muchas gracias por la
Yes. Well, thank
oportunidad.
you
Muchas gracias
kindly
por
for
el
this
espacio para
opportunity, and thank you
reflexionar
so
acá un
much for this
poco
space.
el
I shall be
trabajo y las
talking about
oportunidades que
the work
vemos
and the
nosotros
opportunities and the challenges
para
that we see
bajar, digamos, la
to be
inversión
able to
directa a los territorios y en
directly
ese sentido
convey
en
the
los bienes
investments to these
comunitarios.
territories and to the
El
local
Fondo Territorial
communities.
Mesoamericano creo que
The
una
Mesoamerican
de las
Territorial
cosas
Fund is an
que
example
actualmente se están
of the
haciendo
things
para
that
poder
we're
llegar
doing at present
a
so as to be able
territorios
to
y a más
reach
comunidades.
further
El
territories and
Fondo Territorial
communities. Now,
Mesoamericano
the
tiene
Mesoamerican
respuesta
Territorial Fund is
y es
a
un diseño que
response, and
hace
it's
la
a
Alianza Mesoamericana de
design that the
Biomas,
Mesoamerican
que es una
Alliance of Forests
plataforma de
carries
11
out. It's
organizaciones
a platform of 11
indígenas y de
agencies
comunidades
of
locales,
indigenous
desde
peoples and
México hasta
local
Panamá,
communities from
en
Mexico up to
donde
Panama, where
definieron este
they
mecanismo para
defined a
profesionalizar de alguna
mechanism
manera el
to
acceso a los fondos
professionalize
y
access
bajarlo para
to these
a través de
funds and
canales
to download these
más
funds
seguros, profesionales
through
y con rendición de
safer,
cuentas
professional,
hacia las
and
organizaciones
accountability
que
channels
conforman
towards
la Alianza
those
Mesoamericana
agencies
y
that
más
make up
allá de
the
ella.
Mesoamerican Alliance
Entonces,
and
¿qué
further,
son
even
las
further.
oportunidades
So,
y lo
which
que hacemos
are
es,
the
en primer lugar,
opportunities? What we
hacer
do, first of all, is to
incidencia para recursos a nivel
create great
internacional
incidents
y
for
luego,
resources
además
at
de
an
eso,
international level, and
acelerar el flujo y
thereafter
luego
to have
bajarlo,
access to resources and
profesionalizar
then to download these
inteligente de
resources
manera
in an intelligent
adaptada
manner,
culturalmente
in an
y
adapted from a
también
cultural
haciendo todo
perspective
un
manner.
tema
Of
de
course,
procesos de
carrying out pre-investment procedures so as to be able to train from a technical and financial perspective towards those agencies for these to be able to develop the proper management of these funds and thereafter sustainability concerning their actions. In other words, for these to strengthen these agencies so as to continue managing the resources and implementing projects. Also, the fund is a response to work with less middlemen for these investments to reach these locations and for these to be more cost efficient, to download the resources and to have territorial monitoring networks to cheapen these monitoring costs concerning these investments. I believe that these are the two most important areas where we're working on, and also a differentiated investment in terms of youth, women, and leadership renewal, which is something so complicated and so necessary at the level of the different territories in Mesoamerica. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria Pia. And thank you so much to follow the time allotted. And the question is addressed to Juan Carlos. It's the same question. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be able to greet you and to be able to share this very interesting panel. Throughout this process, it's important to reflect upon the following. The indigenous movement, we know that it has had a long journey since it began in its own territory towards the international system. Well, this relationship hasn't been so friendly with the different states, but yes, of course, we've had collaborators throughout this process, and we faced many challenges. The leaders, men and women, always focus on a specific issue: the security of the territory, the security of our territory, the land deeds of these territories, to make sure that we're visibilized in terms of our rights. Which are our rights? How do we interact with regards to our rights in our own states, within our own jurisdictions, with, of course, many requests and challenges. But at the end of the day, I believe that when we find that intercultural dialogue, that's the respect that we wish to reach, to invite them to sit at the table as equals. And there we shall deal with the issue of training and facilitation. And of course, the dynamics change from the start, from the mid part of this exchange. So the communities with their own land deeds, with the acknowledgement of our own rights, well, this is what we need. We need transparency concerning these global funds. And this cannot continue at present. The minimum is reaching all of us. And we have to talk about the stakeholders. We have rights. Science has mentioned this. But, with regards to financial flows, they reach us in a minimum aspect. So we have organized ourselves. But the challenge is very important. We should not leave aside the indigenous movements. We have to sit down at the table, and that's our invitation. And that is what we wish. We want rights, we want land deeds, we want safety, and the commitments that can be achieved. We can inform you what we have. Science knows about this. Science has produced all of this, and we shall continue pressuring. And as Maria Pia and the other collaborators have said, there are stakeholders that do understand all these dynamics, and we're working hard, but we need to continue working on this for this to be intercultural. We need to deal with these different subject matters. Well, thank you. Thank you, Juan Carlos. Look at everything that we're hearing here. Maria Pia spoke about the topic of the platform of indigenous organizations, these organizations that unite for accountability purposes. And something key that Juan Carlos just spoke about is transparency, legal transparency. What is happening? Aldo, you told us at the start. Now, please tell us more. Thank you, Fabiola. Amazona Investors is an impact mission to protect and regenerate the Amazon and to improve the life quality of the indigenous peoples and the local communities. And this is done mobilizing funds towards these geographies that are difficult to have access to. And as we've already said about this, the barriers, in other words, there is a lack of knowledge of how to invest in the Amazon region and different locations, which are isolated locations. And this is done, as I said, channeling capital, but also investing our own capital. In other words, this means that we believe truly that to invest in indigenous communities, in indigenous enterprises makes sense. They can work, and we understand and we can handle the risks. Based on our experience working in the Amazon with rural agencies on conservation, we believe that investing in farmers' organizations is a strategy, but it's also efficient and quick in mobilizing capital to indigenous peoples and local communities. Why? Because the farmers, the co-ops, and the associations add thousands or hundreds of thousands of small farmers. And if this is done in an innovative manner, and this is what we provide, we can create real impacts concerning the protection of nature. What we're offering are impact credits to incentivize conservation, regeneration, and of course, governance as well. And how do these credits work? We link the credit interest with concrete impact objectives, which have to do with the conservation of primary forests, degraded areas to improve gender activities of these enterprises together with these organizations. And our agency, taking into account and understanding the issues and the difficulties and the different geographies, we're able to invest small tickets, small credits, but also mid-sized ones as well. But we are able to reach to those small organizations that do not require many funds that maybe for other investors it's quite costly. No, we can reach those organizations because we know that they have a large potential, which is what usually happens with the indigenous enterprises. Thank you. Thank you so much. That's it for me for the time being, Fabiola. Thank you, Aldo. This is so important to adjust based on the sizes, small loans, mid-sized, large funds. We need to truly understand things so as to provide these funds. And I see now the next speaker, Mareke. What else can you say from your perspective? What can you contribute with regards to what you're doing at present? Well, thank you, Fabiola.
In English, so anyone who needs to switch to translation, please do. It'll flow more easily for me. So to explain a little bit who Triodos is a sustainable bank in Europe. We were founded 40 years ago, and with the mission to demonstrate how a bank can be at the service of society and the planet, rather than the other way around of putting society at the service of the bank and extracting from the planet. So we are a very mission-driven institution. And we have banks in 5 countries in Europe, and we have an investment management arm, that's where I work, where we finance sustainable projects and companies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. A lot of it is microfinance, but also renewable energy or fair trade, organic farming. With regards to the question, how can we make more financial flows go to nature and indigenous communities? We have done nature financing in Europe through our banks, financing nature conservation organizations and also some restoration projects, primarily in the UK more recently. In the global south, we have not financed nature to date. We have financed smallholders, which I think gives us an important skill set to channel financing to rural communities in the smaller amounts that they are able to absorb. And what we want to do going forward is scale up nature financing or nature-based solutions, as we call it, across the whole group, both in Europe and in emerging markets. And especially for the emerging markets or developing country piece, For us, it is very, very important, in line with the mission and DNA of Triodos Bank, that we take a holistic approach and we finance those projects that are not only looking for carbon credits, which is a big driver of a lot of investors to move into the space, but that are equally focused on biodiversity and on the well-being and the benefits for local communities. So for us, those are really three values that are equally important. And that also implies that we would be delighted to work with projects that are being developed or that involve Indigenous communities. And we have a very strong environmental social framework, so we will put a lot of focus on engaging with such projects in a way that respect and support the values and the aspirations of those communities, which I think we'll get a little bit more into how to do that as a dialogue. I certainly don't have all the answers, but that as much as an introduction in terms of what role Triodos wants to play in this space.
Muchas gracias, Mareike.
Thank you, Mareike. To all of you that are accompanying us, the privilege that we have here. On the one hand side, we have Maria Pia and Juan Carlos that address the perspective of the indigenous communities and the different agencies. And on the other hand, we have Aldo and Mareike that say investors are ready. We're searching for these channels. We're searching for the means and we're doing things. Hence, how can we connect both worlds? And I believe that Juan Carlos and Maria Pia have told us key things. The indigenous have our thoughts, we have our forests, we organize ourselves. And Maria Pia says we organize ourselves through a platform. Not only do we have this platform in our country, but in different countries. So what can we do? I want a dialogue between Maria Pia and Juan Carlos. Now, how can investors, in other words, what's the message to convey to the high levels of this world, to the Mareikes of this world, to understand, for them to understand what the indigenous peoples needs, which are the bridges, which are these indigenous traditions, not the guarantees that they're understood in the conventional world, but how can you manage, Maria Pia and Juan Carlos, these subject matters? I believe, well, thank you so much for the question, Fabiola. I believe it's relevant to always feel empathic. There has to be empathy on both sides. So here there are different parties. First of all, there is an interest to have access to resources. That's key. But there is also an interest to have access to resources in a respectful manner and for these resources to be useful towards the agenda of these territories. Hence, we have to differentiate that every need is different. Yes, they can all be indigenous peoples, but within different contexts. Hence, the resources in a certain way needs to be thought of as being flexible, which is different to giving it to an enterprise or giving it to a micro enterprise, which is a non-indigenous enterprise in different contexts. Hence, I believe that we need to have a certain cultural degree of flexibility. I do not believe that the indigenous peoples and the organizations, they're not saying that there is no accountability. They're not saying that it's a blank check. No, that is not it. Nobody gives a blank check to anyone. It means that things need to be more flexible, less rigid with regards to procedures and what is known as the procurements. In other words, taking into account the specificities of each one of these organizations. This on the one hand side, and on the other, it's important to create the capabilities and to create environments where the investor within their own investment dedicates an amount which is for the creation of capacity building strengthening of the institutions, convey learnings, lessons learned to these organizations. In other words, there's two faces of the coin: to understand that both parties have needs and both parties need to follow certain procedures. How? How do you download it? How do you tie it to all of this? It's not only to have access to loans for something very specific. No, it's to have access to a loan together with the creation of capabilities, because that's the truth. You know, there is an issue of capacity building that we need to work upon. Well, that's it for me. Thank you. This is very interesting. Before giving the floor to Juan Carlos, hey, Juan Carlos, you had talked about the transparency matter and the development of capabilities, and that's complemented perfectly well with what we're being said at present. In other words, we need flexibility. We need to have a specific intercultural focus. Juan Carlos, you have the floor. Yes, definitely, I do agree. I simply wish to say that this is the aperture that we need. Through this path, we have been criminalized within different contexts when we claim certain things. You're only here to request, you're protesting, you're always reclaiming certain things, but there is a context. So when there is empathy, it means that you're going to hear me out. You're going to hear me out with respect, and you're going to hear which is the cultural vision, not only of one people, of millions of people. We are many that can build processes and can go through this journey and provide solutions. And that's where we see respect. Of course, conveying different things. Maybe certain things do not work, but we're not going to stop there. We need to build, we need to convey the trust. You listen to my territory. I respect you. I show you. And much of this has caused pain. It has created mistrust for different reasons. It's not our fault for a geopolitical issue from a specific location or a crisis, and we make others guilty. No, we have to have much clarity on this.
Bajo esos principios, yo creo que hay que
Under those principles, I think that we would have to sit down at that table again and build the trust, because we shouldn't, with work, with trust, with empathy, and everything being discussed here will lead us to the next step, which is to build and to invite the rest of the entities that wish to join, because there's a common goal, right? And at the end of the day, it's really important to understand the human perspective. Resources in nature need to be protected because of the context. Those resources will help contribute to different life territories, and we need to better understand how to contribute with that. We're not only beneficiaries, we're actors. There are things that we need to continue to educate ourselves upon and to share the social and cultural visions. You cannot measure something that is social and cultural as we do. We're part of the ecosystem, right? Waterfalls, the trees, it's all part of the same thing, but we need empathy, right? Towards the donors, towards by giving trust, right? And I believe that we can contribute. There are beautiful examples that we can share. We just need to remove the myths and continue to build an action, because we'll be there to contribute. This is such an interesting conversation, because when you normally speak about mechanisms in the financial system, the return rate and things like that. Everything's economic and we just give hard data, right? But in this case, we're actually talking about human emotions. We're talking about empathy, about dialogue, about being resilient, and we're talking about other experiences too, because they're part of it all as well. How can there be reconciliation where the circumstances may have not allowed us to move forward, right? So those are the soft skills that we usually leave neglected. So I think that these are wonderful ideas. I don't know, Maria Pia, if there's anything else you wish to add or you feel to add something before we move on to the next block. Now, I would just like to end by saying that these are key spaces to open up communication spaces. And the banking sector has made efforts with innovative initiatives to come closer to the groups, to the target audiences. And much is being done already, but there's still a long road ahead. And that more square mindset of the banking sector is indeed understandable, but there are paths to have access to funds because we're not only speaking about investing in the peoples, but in the ecosystems and the ecosystems they want to protect that are a heritage of the people and humanity as a whole. Thank you, Juan Carlos. Is there anything else? Yes, I would just like to add that beyond the financial economic system, which is of high necessity, we need the opportunity to connect with the purpose of life and what we believe about the cultural, cultural aspects that are somewhat difficult to convey and to measure and to give the numbers, but we've made an attempt, we've tried it, and we need to acknowledge that my brothers and sisters have made an effort, they're learning, they're educating themselves, we're adapting to this historical process. It's there, as Maria Pia mentioned, we have created global mechanisms, and we may not have time right now to explain, but we should understand with transparency how good people want to collaborate, they want to connect. So where does the money go? The money given by philanthropists to the donors or by bankers, it needs to be grounded to the territory. So we need to take a look at the more human context, at the more territorial context linked to the rights of nature and the rights of the indigenous peoples. Thank you. Thank you, Juan Carlos. We continue to talk about innovation in mindset, innovation on how things are dealt with. Of course, you cannot deal equally with climate change, but you cannot deal equally on how to build new relationships between human beings. Of course, climate change is a huge challenge ahead, but it's also allowing us to have an opportunity to acknowledge that the larger issue is not us, but it's ahead of us. So how are we going to build alignment? The indigenous peoples and the platforms acknowledge the financial sector is making a huge effort, just like the indigenous communities are making the most to shut down the gap, to get training, and to be profitable. Because I would like to remind you all that philanthropy is extremely important. It's super important, but we're speaking of financing as an investment, as an opportunity. It shouldn't be seen as a way to win more, to earn more money, but to invest. So Maria Pia and Juan Carlos, thank you, because I would like to take a look at Aldo's perspective and Marek's perspective. What's your take on this conversation and what are the key innovations to make progress in these processes? Aldo, shall we start with you? Or with you, Mariki? Yes, Fabiola, I can start. I think we're going to switch to English in this session. Am I right?
Si quieres lo haces en español o en
No, en
As
inglés.
you
español.
may, you can continue to speak in Spanish. Much easier. Juan Carlos and Maria Pia said two key things. They talked about respect and transparency. I believe that is key. That indigenous peoples have fought for the acknowledgement of their lands is huge, and what they've done is amazing. So globally speaking, the different actors in the countries have agreed and made the decision to channel funds to climate funds to the indigenous populations, and they need to stay at the forefront of the negotiation table in the decision-making process. And Maria Pia mentioned the funds need to reach them directly. A study carried out a few years ago mentioned that less than 1% of climate funds reach the communities, and that can no longer continue to happen. That on one side. And although it's difficult and it's also expensive to channel the funds directly to the communities, as Maria Pia mentioned, to capacity building at community and organization level is also required and should, of course, be taken into account. We need to remember that sometimes it's not part of the costs or the budget, but if we really, as I mentioned initially, if we really want to efficiently preserve the forests and the biodiversity, it will be done through the indigenous peoples, because over 30% of the Amazon covers the indigenous territories. So the more efficient way to protect biodiversity is through working with the indigenous peoples, and that needs to change. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Aldo. Mariki?
Yes, thank you. Very, very interesting conversation. So what I heard from Juan Carlos and Maria Pia is a lot about respect and empathy and transparency. And I think that is fundamental, and I think that's where it should start. So I think maybe the innovation is more than anything in the attitude of how you approach each other. And that may mean that you find each other in respect and empathy before you start talking about interest rates and structures and tenors and all those financial conversations that bankers like to have. And I think that's very often that first step is not taken. It may also mean that, as Maria Pia rightly mentioned, that the financial sector is quite cuadrado. And we like to go to a potential client and put them through our process. And that may not be the right approach. If you really want to be respectful, you also have to be respectful to the fact that your process may just not be it's not on equal terms, right? If you impose your process on someone else. So I think an alternative approach would be to come together and say, let's together define the process that we're going to go through. It does need to meet a lot of requirements that we have to deal with on our side, but let's construct it together. So I think that's all the starting point, and that all sounds beautiful. What it also means is that you will have to spend a lot more time, that you'll incur a lot more costs, and that's, I think, what makes it challenging for investors, is that you have to deal, with risks and returns and cost levels, and somehow still make it work in such a way that it's attractive enough for people to put their money to it. And I would like to also just remind everybody that, at least in our case as an investment manager, it's not our money. We actually manage the money of others. And in the case of Triodos, it is a lot of retail clients. So it's people like you, like me on the panel here and in the audience, and we cannot lose their money. So we have this fiduciary duty to take very good care of their money at the same time. So that's where all the attitude cuadrado, I can't think of a good English word to translate that, comes from, is that we are sort of also the guardians of other people's money, and it's our responsibility. And I think bringing those two things together, that's where the challenge is. And I think it's definitely not easy, but I think that's where we have to have the conversations. And I think they will go differently if you start from that basis of respect and empathy.
Es genial esta conversación. La verdad es que hablar con gente que trabaja en el sector financiero.
This is an amazing conversation because we're talking to the financial sector about empathy, about reading risks differently. So what can we do that actually innovates the financial sector? Because we can come up with thousands of nature-based solutions, but without funding, there's no such opportunity. Funding is critical, and the sense of urgency is unprecedented. That is the challenge we are facing ourselves with. Let's add an extra minute. Let's give that extra minute to Aldo to share, to everybody to share an idea. Go ahead. Thank you, Fabiola. The need of bringing risks down for investors, because yes, at large, fund managers are responsible for other people's money, right? So the need to reduce the risk.
En paralelo, tiene que haber una disminución de riesgo para los pueblos
should in tandem reduce the risk for the indigenous population. So I'm thinking that on one hand, the role of governments, the role of multilateral banks, financial development institutions, the key role they play to bring risks down for private investors. And it has been, the solution is blended finance. Capital is required to reduce investors' risks. And after having this conversation, it is clear that blended finance should attain the indigenous populations to bring their risks down too. How are we going to do that? Through local capacity building, which is very relevant. Blended finance are two-sided. And I also wanted to talk about the need of having specialized organizations that may create a bridge between the two worlds so they can move capital, knowing how and where to invest by understanding the culture, the language, and the way indigenous people live their cosmovision, right? I think it is key, and things will just won't work without that. Excellent. Thank you, Mariki.
Thank you, Aldo, for mentioning those points, because they're excellent and I wanted to mention them too. But since you've explained them so well, I get to mention a third point. I did want to say that blended finance for us as a private sector investor is very crucial to make it work. And we're working on blended finance vehicles to do nature-based solutions. But the third point I wanted to leave with you, and maybe it's a point for a future conversation, for global investors that want to channel financing to indigenous communities, I think the biggest issue that's holding a lot of them back is reputational risk. If you're an impact investor and something goes wrong in one of your impact projects, it's really bad for your reputation. And for banks and investors, reputation and credibility is the biggest asset. If something goes wrong in your impact project with an indigenous community, your reputation is dead. And there are plenty of media and NGOs that will bash you really, really hard if something goes wrong and then it involves an indigenous communities. That's why I think a lot of global investors actually are well-meaning, but say, let's stay away from that because that risk is hard to eliminate. There's always a risk that things go wrong. And if it were to happen, the consequences would be too damaging. So I think that's a dialogue we should have. How can both sides actually work together to mitigate that risk?
Muchísimas gracias. Y me han hecho la vida un poco más fácil porque yo estaba pensando y
Thank you.
pensando.
And you just made my life easier because I was thinking about how to wrap this session up, but you just gave me the key.
Organizaciones indígenas e inversionistas aquí, ¿no?
Indigenous organizations and investors are present today, but for those enabling conditions, for the reputational considerations of significance, we need actors to follow through these processes as observers to guarantee that there's transparency. But we need the IDB, we need the World Bank too. So along with the state, they can converse and analyze comprehensively how to build a proposal where the indigenous populations with respect are part of the intercultural dialogue with the financial system, trying to create the necessary conditions for civil society organizations who are also highly experienced in dialogue, and they can put it at the service of the new way we can build not a region, not a country, but I'm talking about the global village, the global reality that needs to change. Thank you so much. This was such a fruitful conversation. To those of you who joined us this morning, to the facilitators of the discussion, I can't tell you how happy I was to moderate the session. Let's give each other a show of hands before we leave. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It was such an honor to facilitate this meeting. Thank you.